yeah. Okay, let's start at once. We're starting. Okay. We are very excited to host Geoff Borman today to give a talk about some of his newest and sounds very exciting research. Jeff is a professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has too many accolades for me to tell you about. He's an ARA fellow, has an ARA early career grant. What he studies basically is how we impact social inequality that's happening in school and how we fix it with the policies and programs that Jeff studies. And so Jeff will talk about some of that work today. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'm glad to see such a packed house here. It's wonderful. So, I've done a lot of work on social inequality throughout my career and studied a lot of high-profile, usually very high-cost interventions to try to turn around struggling schools. So, for instance, maybe some of you are familiar with some of my past work on comprehensive school reform and interventions like Success for All, which can cost as much as $500,000, $600,000 for a typical school to implement during a given year. Well, recently, I came across a series of articles in Science magazine, which is, the preeminent journal in the sciences, and was just struck by a series of several articles that came out, essentially showing that through these creative, very theoretically precise social psychological interventions, that we could have impacts on students' mindsets, and as a result, have impacts on their academic performance through these very, very virtually costless, very brief interventions that we give to students in a typical school setting, which basically asks them to reflect on certain values that are important to them and to write about them and to think about them. What Geoffrey Cohen and his colleagues, Geoffrey Cohen's a professor at Stanford University, he showed in a couple of classrooms that this intervention closed 40% of the black-white achievement gap in one academic year. And when I saw this evidence and when I saw it in science, I thought, why are we not scaling up interventions like this across entire school districts? As a matter of fact, why aren't we using interventions like this in all of our schools? And so what I wanted to try to do with this intervention is to work with Geoffrey Cohen to come up with a replication where we might produce these impacts district-wide. And so we got an IES grant and we implemented a randomized controlled trial in the Madison public school system where there are 11 middle schools that participated, all 11 middle schools participated in this work. And that's what I'm going to tell you about today. So I've been, over the past 3 years, have developed a partnership with the Madison School District, and we've been scaling up these interventions over the past 3 years and really have had some remarkable success that I want to tell you about today. So this is the sustained effects of a brief self-affirmation intervention on students' academic outcomes. I'm going to tell you about results. We intervened during 1 year, during the 7th grade year, and we've tracked these students now through 8th grade and now through 9th grade, which I'm going to report today. We have our 10th grade results that the district is just starting to share with us now, so we're going to be able to look at these sustained impacts over time. We intervened only 1 year, and these students received only 3 to 4 versions of this exercise, which I'm going to show to you up here, over that 7th grade year. And after that, we discontinued it, and we've seen these intervention impacts sustained over the years. I have a number of students who have helped me with this work. These are all students of mine who have gone on to bigger and better things. You can see their current institutional affiliations listed there. So just a little bit of background. We affectionately call this project MWAP, the Madison Writing and Achievement Project. I'll tell you a little bit about kind of the motivation for this study and a little bit of the background and some background on the study design, and then finally move to the findings. And where we track these students from grade 7 through 9th. Do we find impacts at scale for African American and Latino students is the first question I ask. And then, are there particular contexts under which these interventions have stronger impacts than others? We're in 11 different schools. Geoffrey Cohen didn't have the benefit of only being in 2 classrooms. He couldn't identify any sort of contextual variation in impacts. So in this study, we can look at impacts across these 11 schools and see if there are differences across schools. So I really became interested in this work also by noticing in school system data this pattern of disengagement, is what I call it, that we find over time, if we track grade point average, for instance, through the secondary years as students move through middle school and high school. And Jackie Eccles has written about this a lot, that there's this mismatch between what middle schools do and how adolescents are developing. And often what we find is that all students tend to lose ground academically as they progress through middle school and secondary school in general. It's this really depressing tale that I see in the data, that you see a clear linear trend downward in students' grade point average, that attendance tends to wane as students go through school, that more behavioral problems pop up, and that these problems are especially acute for African American students and Latino students as they progress through school. And a lot of this are, things that we see in the data that predict later dropping out of school and other very non-positive things that students move through. So how many of you, just by raise of hand, have heard of this idea of stereotype threat? Okay, pretty much all of you. Here's kind of the classic definition that comes from Claude Steele. He's at Stanford University, and at the time his student Joshua Aronson, who's now at NYU, and this is how they describe this idea of stereotype threat. Now there's a lot going on in this quote, and I want to unpack a couple of things that are important to me when I read this quote. First thing is that this idea of stereotype threat, that when African American students, when Latino students identify with their racial ethnic group, and when they understand these broader societal ideas, stereotypes that are within our schools, within our society in general, that African American kids and Latino kids are expected to underperform in school. They internalize these messages, and bad things happen to these students through a variety of mechanisms, both physiological, psychological, and social. And that not only do these effects interfere with a student's ability to do well on a standardized test when they sit for a standardized test, and Claude Steele argues that just by merely putting a standardized test in front of a student, that can activate stereotype threat. That when you're confronted with an evaluative task as a minority student, that can activate these mechanisms that may interfere with your ability to perform well on a test. And in fact, what literature has shown, 300 field experiments, 300 laboratory studies have shown, is that about a quarter of the black-white achievement gap is simply an illusion. That it is caused by this inability to perform well and to perform up to your true ability on standardized tests. That a quarter of the achievement gap can be explained by this phenomenon of stereotype threat. And the other important thing that is kind of bolded in red here is that not only does it affect a student's ability to perform well on one standardized test, but that this over time can have this further effect by pressuring these students to protectively disidentify. That if we disregard school as something important to our core, that can actually productively make us feel better about ourselves. And it's actually students who really identify with academics and who are good students who really feel the weight of the stereotypes most strongly. So this not only can impact your ability to perform well on standardized tests, but can also cause further detriment to your learning over time as you progress through school. So we came up with kind of this model of stereotype threat, where if students identify with a racial ethnic group that our society deems to underperform in academic settings, if the stereotype is salient and they identify with that stereotype threat, that can cause these threats, that your group identity is challenged by these salient negative stereotypes. And then that can also cause these stress responses that people have measured in the laboratory and in field settings, such as physiological stress measured through cortisol, such as increased vigilance, decreased working memory to perform well on standardized tests, distraction from school, and that those stress responses then degrade performance and learning. And once you've seen that your performance and learning isn't up to what it should be, that can have this negative recursive cycle where it then feeds back into that threat over time, and you feel the weight of the stereotypes even stronger as you go through school. What we also did with this study is explored how school context might play a role in stereotype threat. That maybe in some schools, the stereotypes are more salient, are more strong, and students feel the weight of them more strongly than they do in other settings. So we also wanted to look at the impact of how the school context might shape this whole pattern. So the idea of self-affirmation, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in the next few slides, is that by putting this intervention in front of kids at a high stress time, right before they take a standardized test, right before they're taking a big midterm exam, that we can buffer students from feeling some of that threat, and that we can reduce the experience of that threat, we can reduce some of those negative stress responses, and in the end have a positive impact on performance and learning, where teachers actually see results on formative assessment, on measures of academic progress, which is one of the standardized tests that we put these interventions right in front of, and see that students are performing better on those assessments, and that actually, in teachers' eyes and in the eyes of their students, and the eyes of the students themselves, they feel, hey, I can do this, I'm a good student, and that can then cause to diminish some of these threats and cause some of these positive recursive effects where you accumulate these small wins over time, and that can have a positive effect on your learning and outcomes over time as you progress through school. Another way to think about this idea of self-affirmation and how it works is what we ask kids to do is to think about other values outside of the academic realm that they might find happiness in, that they might enjoy. So for instance, we have in this intervention a list of 11 different values. Some of these deal with roles that students might play in other realms outside of the academic realm. For instance, being an athlete, or being a good artist, or being a good friend. That religion might be an important consequence to some students. That we remind students that there are these other things going on in their lives that create your overall sense of value as a human being, your overall global self-integrity, that all of these different ideas and roles and domains in your lives feed into that overall global self-integrity. So if I have a bad day as a researcher, for instance, I might think, well, I'm actually a pretty good dad, or I'm actually a pretty good runner, so maybe some of these other things in my life that I am good at can make me feel better about my situation and give me some solace in that situation. So what we're doing with this work is replicating and scaling up the work of Geoffrey Cohen and his colleagues. What they found was that this intervention, the self-affirmation intervention, had statistically significant positive impacts on the grade point averages of African American students who were randomly assigned to receive the self-affirmation intervention. This study that he did was limited to just a few classrooms, and it was just African American and white students. There were no Latino students in his sample. He found average effects across 7th and 8th grades that cut about 40% of the black-white school performance gap on GPA. And then that Sherman, who did a follow-up study, found similar impacts in a different kind of setting where it was predominantly Latino and white students. This is what the intervention looks like. And I know you can't really see it so well, but the main point that I want to get across to you are two things. Number one, that this is the treatment exercise, okay? And this is the control exercise. They look virtually identical. And if you can imagine yourself, we did random assignment at the student level. So within classrooms, there are some students who are treatment students and some students who are control students. So if you can imagine sitting next to your partner looking over, you're not really going to see a difference between the treatment and the control exercise. And they're actually cleverly designed to ask students to do similar things. The treatment exercise asks students to circle one of these 2 to 3 of these 11 values that are most important to them, and then to reflect on them and write an expressive essay about them, taking about 15 minutes. We do this 3 to 4 times over the academic year. We change up the writing exercise a little bit. This is the first exercise that we administer, but just to maintain interest and not to put the same sheet of paper in front of kids 4 times over the academic year, we do change it up to make it interesting. These 11 values is what Geoffrey Cohen calls them, are things like enjoying sports, being good at art, being creative, being independent, living in the moment, listening to music, following politics or government, which is the least circled value that students find important as 7th graders. And then in the control exercise, which you see to the right-hand side, we present that same 11 list of values. And what we ask control students to do is to circle the 2 to 3 values that are least important to them, and then to imagine why they might be important to somebody else. So, in other words, this other exercise, the control exercise, kind of teaches this idea of empathy, or putting yourself in the shoes of somebody else, okay? So it's not a bad thing to learn, but it's not the same self-affirming kind of intervention that we see here on the left. And students then, this, incidentally, politics was the most frequently chosen value of control students who weren't at all interested in politics, but thought, yeah, you know, my parents, they're interested that Scott Walker is our new leader in Wisconsin, or Obama is our president, and that makes a difference for the lives of my parents. So at any rate, these are the two exercises, and the treatment and the control, just to give you kind of a picture for what they look like. So just to contrast our study with the Cohen et al. Work, we were in 11 schools across Madison. Geoffrey Cohen and his colleagues were in 1 school. We have a sample of over 1,000 students in this cohort compared to 133. We were working with 44 teachers, and you can see kind of some of the simple data. We've coded all of these written exercises and have some other interesting data on that based on coding of these exercises and what students actually write. But we find on average students write about 79 words in their essays. We had 4 administrations of the exercise. When I talked to Jeff Cohen, he suggested, you know, there's no difference really that we found between 4 or 5 exercises, so I go with 3 to 4. So we went with 4 exercises here. We administer the exercises at kind of critical points during the school year. The first exercise occurs right at the beginning of the school year, in the second week of school, to kind of create that positive recursive cycle, beginning right from the beginning of the school year. It's also right before the fall MAP test, the measures of academic performance. Then the second test, we're weird in Wisconsin. For some reason, we give our state test in the fall, which is kind of unusual. But the state standardized test, the WKCE, happens right in early November, and that's when we administer the second exercise. And then the third exercise is right when they come back from winter break, right before another MAP test that's administered during that time. And then finally the fourth exercise happens before that final May MAP test that's given in the spring. So, I mean, let me remind you, just these exercises consist of several sheets of paper. We provide a 30-minute training at the beginning of the school year to teachers on how to administer the exercises, but essentially they're self-administered, where students take the intervention out of a packet, complete it, put it back into the packet, and hand it back to the teacher. The teacher never sees the responses. It's a completely double-blind experiment where teachers nor students are aware of their treatment status. So, to look at kind of the external validity of our study, we did a pretty good job, we thought, in recruiting students. We had to get both parent consent and student assent. So we had to get both of those things. We wound up ultimately with 54% of the entire district sample on 7th grade. And we actually did better in our next year and the year after that, so we improved our procedures. This is kind of some important data on the internal validity of our experiment, in that, by expectation, we would hope that the random assignment would produce equivalent treatment and control groups on a variety of dimensions, and in fact it did. The most important attribute that I want to focus on is their prior 6th grade GPA. So what was their income and grade point average? For the self-affirmation group, it was 3.24. For the control group, it was 3.26. So in all respects, they were virtually identical. There were no statistically significant differences between the two groups on any of these background characteristics. So the first question is, do we find impacts at scale for African American and Latino students? Now remember, this exercise is really intended to help students with stereotype threat. The idea is to buffer students from stereotype threat. So we would have no theoretical reason to think that this intervention would impact white kids in any way. So we're expecting to find not main effects, but an interaction effect where African American and Latino students would benefit from this intervention and white kids would not. And what we find is exactly that there are no impacts at all for white kids, but we find statistically significant impacts for African American and Latino kids. We grouped the two kids together because essentially the impacts were equivalent, whether you were African American or Latino, and which is really consistent with the work of Cohen and David Sherman, who found almost identical effects when we contrasted Latino and white kids versus African American and white kids. So in 7th grade, we found no statistically significant effect within that first year of receiving the intervention. But once students got into the 8th grade, after we discontinued the intervention, but after students had experienced these 4 written exercises over the course of the full 7th grade year, we found statistically significant impacts that were equivalent to an effect size over here. These are Cohen's D effect sizes, equivalent to an effect size of 0.15. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with, I did a meta-analysis on comprehensive school reform programs. And these are big, expensive programs that cost lots of money and lots of time to implement. And that impact of 0.15 is actually larger than the average impact I found for all comprehensive school reform programs, which was 0.11, about 1/10 of a standard deviation impact for comprehensive school reform programs. This, through 3 to 4 writing packets, we're seeing impacts of 0.15. Those impacts were sustained over 9th grade, and when we look at the full 7th through 9th grade impact, we find an effect size that's not much different than that, 0.13. So these effects build over time based on small wins that students experience over time, and these effects are sustained even after the intervention is discontinued. To kind of look at this as a figure, we can see this trend in the data. These are, with the triangles up here, those are Asian and white control kids. The diamond represent Asian and white treatment kids. And so we see virtually no difference between these two groups. Whether you receive the treatment or whether you're in the control group, there's really not much of a difference. And there's not much of a decline in grade point average over time. But if you look over time, these are the 4 different grading time periods within each of the 7th and 8th grade year. And then in high school, there are only 2 grading periods based on semesters once the kids got into high school. So we see this linear decline over time in grade point average, and that decline is especially pronounced for minority students. But what we find here is that we have the control students here who are the square and dotted lines, and we have the Black and Hispanic treatment kids who are the round icons here with the solid line. And what we see over time is that especially through 7th and 8th grade, it mitigated that decline in grade point average over time. And in 9th grade, it mitigated that decline to some extent, although we see a little bit of fade out here by the time that students got to the end of the high school year. So they're in a completely different school building, in this completely different school context. So it might be the case that some booster or some additional kind of intervention is needed once kids make the transition to high school. But nevertheless, I was impressed that these effects were maintained over time, even after kids made that transition to high school. So we can look at this trend over time as a linear model. So if we use a hierarchical linear model to estimate what students' grade point average is as predicted by an intercept, and those 8 terms over time as kids go through school, we can predict as a linear function how their grade point average changes over time. We also use a treatment indicator to look at that slope, that slope in terms of the term. So this is the slope we're trying to predict over time. What's that decline over time? And we find that there, in fact, is a statistically significant decline in grade point average over time. That over time, it's 2/10 of a grade point average, but over time that accumulates. Over 8, 10 grading periods, that accumulates over time. And that basically with the intervention, the treatment, does is it mitigates that decline. You can see essentially that it prevents that decline from happening. So for kids who are getting the treatment, it essentially erases that decrement in grade point average. This analysis is just confined to the African American and Latino students, the 345 students in our sample, and what their linear trend and grade point average looks like over time for both treatment and control. So we also have that same model through the end of 9th grade, and we don't see a statistically significant slope for treatment anymore, but still that negative impact persists in grade point average. So are the benefits of self-affirmation different depending on what school you go to? That was the next question that we explored. And what we hypothesized is that racial identity is related to academic processes differently at different types of schools. Two structural features that we thought might be linked to racial and academic identities is, number one, what's the relative presence in your school of other minority students? So if you're one of a few African American and Latino kids in your school, that could cue stereotypes even more strongly than if it were a school of predominantly minority students. Also, what's your relative academic position relative to the non-minority group? If there's a larger achievement gap separating you from your peers, you might feel the stereotypes more strongly in those kinds of cases. And so what we found is that there were 7 schools that we could classify in Madison, 7 out of 11 schools that we could classify that really met these criteria, that there were an overwhelming number of white kids in those schools, and that there were really large achievement gaps separating the white and Latino and African American kids in those schools. Now, this is not unusual in that there have been prior lab experiments that Claude Steele has done, where he's basically set up these laboratories where a minority student goes in to take a standardized test, and there are other students in the laboratory who are predominantly white or who are predominantly minority, and he randomizes this based on the condition and finds that basically in those situations where you are one of the few minority students in that classroom taking that test, that degrades your performance even more so. And so we're seeing to what extent social context might also play into these intervention effects that we're seeing. This has been the first kind of study that I know of that's looked at this kind of contextual effect in school settings outside of the laboratory. So these two hypothesized demographic features we measured, the presence of potentially susceptible students, fewer Black and Latino students in the cohort should imply greater potential threat, and the relative academic position, if those average racial gaps in performance were larger, those would imply a greater potential threat for students as well. And indeed what we find is that when we look at across all 11 schools, these are the impacts that I showed you before, but when we restrict it just to the high threat schools, those 7 schools that are mostly non-minority schools and where the achievement gaps are the largest, that's where we see by far our largest impacts. That in fact, if you look at the other 4 schools that have less threatening contexts, there's virtually no impact of the intervention. And the intervention's impacts are really confined to these 7 schools in which there are those larger kind of social cues that might prompt the stereotypes to be more strongly felt by minority students. And in fact, these impacts are getting quite large, on the order of about a fifth to nearly a quarter of a standard deviation, which incidentally squares quite well with the amount that the stereotype threat explains in terms of student performance. So again, the idea that the intervention seems to be buffering students from stereotypes and to show their full ability on both measures of GPA, and we've also looked at standardized test outcomes as well. So just to summarize, we essentially replicated the findings of Cohen and Sherman. We did not find that it cut the Black-white achievement gap by 40%, but what we did find is that district-wide, it cut those achievement gaps by about 25%, which is nothing to sneeze at when we look at this impact at scale. So I think we show that this self-affirmation intervention can be effective at scale, although not necessarily in every school. And we've shown in ways in which this intervention can be scaled up to work effectively in certain types of schools, but perhaps not all of them, because school context moderates the effects of this self-affirmation. We've looked at other questions, and we have papers that are being developed right now in some other areas. For instance, we're looking at how self-affirmation affects students' behavioral and disciplinary outcomes. We're finding fewer behavioral referrals. So on average, the average treatment kid gets referred to, gets expelled or gets suspended or sent to the principal's office one less time per academic year relative to control students. And so if you add that up, we have on average about 100 treatment kids per school. It's 100 less referrals to the principal's office per academic year, which can make a big difference at the school level. We're also looking at how is the intervention implemented. We're the first study to really collect some good implementation and fidelity data from teachers. We interviewed teachers. We figured out what they were doing. There are some things that the teachers shouldn't say about this intervention, that it's research, for instance, is a bad thing to say. And they're supposed to really kind of make it more seem like a natural thing that students should do as part of the classroom activity. And so we have some interesting data about how implementation can affect this intervention's efficacy. And then finally, was there variation in the content of the students' written responses? And we're finding some really interesting data by going through and actually, using some software to kind of look at what students wrote about and how they expressed themselves in these writing exercises. And if they actually carried out the exercise as we directed them to, we see stronger benefits for students when they follow the directions. So these are some of the other questions that we're looking to, and I look forward to hearing some of your questions. Yes?
I have two questions. First of all, I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you for being here today. So the original Stereotype Threat research, as you're more than well aware, was looking at the impact on test performance. GPA is, a conglomerate. It's not exactly test performance. Do you have test performance scores if you're interested to see? And then the second question is, how does your effect size compare to inoculation effects and the reduction of stereotype threat through inoculation? Do you beat inoculation effects?
Okay, so the first question is, yes, we do see impacts on some test scores. So when folks have implemented some of these stereotype threat studies in the laboratory, what do you think is the most threatening test to put in front of a student? What?
SAT.
Well, okay, so if we focus on content. Math, exactly. And so that's kind of the prototypical test that in the laboratory people use to, most people are scared of math, and students who are experiencing stereotype threat are particularly nervous about a math test that was put in front of them. And so we find the biggest impacts on math achievement. So we find there's an online version right now of an article that we have out based on the first year data where we show impacts at scale on the math achievement outcomes for students, but kind of mixed evidence in terms of impacts on literacy outcomes. That's where we find the strongest impacts. And now this inoculation idea, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with what...
This is the classic manipulation that Steele did where, you come in and you say, the stereotype threat, you come in and say, there's been differences shown on this for tests for, different populations. Well, the inoculation is you come in and say, this test has been shown to have no differences in populations, and that actually reduces the stereotype threat effect. So it's just a typical inoculation effect where you disavow that the test has any difference and you do it deliberately.
Yeah.
And that tends to ameliorate the effect. And so I'm not sure what the effect size is on that, but I was really curious as to see if you beat those traditional inoculation manipulations.
I'll have to look at that a little bit more closely because I'm not really sure. That sounds like a very similar message, though. There's been some more recent work by Sian Belek, who wrote an interesting book called Choke, and it's about how students kind of all races and ethnicities tend to choke under the pressure of taking a test. And she's devised these interventions that basically say to students, you know that stress you feel when you're about to take a test? That actually, research has shown that that's a positive force that you can use to do better on the test. And in fact, that intervention has some impacts on student performance. My question, though, would be, how durable are those impacts? You know, and to what extent do they hold up over time? Whether it be the inoculation kind of impact, or whether it be the work of Cian, I'm not really sure how those effects might hold up over time. And what particularly impresses me about these results and self-affirmation in general is the ability to create these small wins that can build up into this positive kind of recursive benefit that students experience even long after the intervention has gone away. Yeah.
Did you look at any other differences related to student characteristics, like whether the intervention was particularly more effective for kids who were lower performing to begin with?
Yeah, we did look at that, and we didn't find any sort of differences based on level of performance, level of incoming performance. The theory would suggest that kids who value academics the most, and who are from minority backgrounds, are really set up to feel the greatest weight of stereotype threat, and that you care deeply about doing well academically, and you identify with a racial ethnic group that has been, our society has fed these ideas that your group underperforms, that those are the students who theoretically should benefit particularly from the intervention. But we find no differences based on incoming achievement level.
For different parts of, so if you disaggregated the GPA and just did math scores, math class scores, or science scores, did you see any impacts on the different grades?
Yeah, that's an interesting question about math versus ELA performance, and we haven't investigated that specifically. What we did do, though, is we looked at differences on kind of core academic classes versus like gym and that kind of thing. I mean, our GPA estimates combine everything, they're weighted averages, so based on how many credit hours the particular class was, it's weighted up that heavily in the overall GPA. But we've looked at both core academic grades and overall GPA, and the impacts are virtually identical. But that's an interesting idea, that maybe the impacts might be stronger on math grades.
Well, they say they're, one of the things that they self-affirm is I'm a great artist, and then their art grade is I'm a great athlete, and then their PE grade goes up. I mean, that would be awesome.
That's true too. Yeah, that's a good point too. Yes.
I'm interested because, it seems like your initial goal is to kind of deal with issues of stereotype threat that relate somehow to microaggressions. But then this is this self-affirmation on you academically. But so when I think about this is beautiful, this is clean, this is an RCT, this is cost effective, but what is it really doing for the school context? When we tell a teacher with this simple exercise, you kind of feel good. What are we doing about all the other important dimensions from the school, like the social emotional development that some schools have invested a lot, that will, in my a priori, be much more a much intense way of dealing with that?
Yeah, those are excellent points. I mean, so this study is done as an RCT, where we blind teachers to conditions, because the critic could come back and say, oh, well, it's simply explained by the fact that the teacher knows the treatment status of the kids, and so they grade up that student under the expectation that they should be performing better. So our random assignment process and the double-blind aspect of our experiment takes away that potential claim. However, if I were looking to scale this up as, after the experiment was over, and I've talked about the school district about how we might do that, I would definitely want students to share those essays with the teachers, for there to be some formal kind of, that there's been other research that suggests that once teachers get to know other aspects of their students, and other ideas, other things that might be important to them outside of the school setting, and things that they might have in common with them. That maybe the teacher is a good soccer player, and the student writes about being a soccer player and how that's important to him or her. That could cause, other opportunities for students and teachers to connect with one another, and maybe even more powerful ways that might amplify the impacts of this intervention even more so. And so, yeah, I think that there's really strong opportunities to take this and design different types of activities and curricular supports around it that might make it even more powerful. Yes?
In your last third bullet point, you mentioned that you're looking at the different kinds of values that students choose. I was wondering if you have some preliminary findings you could share, and if not, what your hypotheses might be as to which one seems to be more powerful.
Sure. So, of course, we're kind of more in the non-experimental correlational realm and with those kinds of analyses, because we're looking at students who self-select a particular value, and so we don't know what might be different about those kinds of students who select that particular value. But some of the evidence that we've looked at shows a promising connection between students who identify the value of friends and family. And so this idea of social belonging, this idea about fitting in, about having peers, friends, or family who genuinely care about you and love you and who support you, those are some, for those students who write about those kinds of social ties, we find some of the strongest impacts for those students. And actually, that's one thing that inspired me to implement another intervention that we're just unpacking the data now and starting to look at all the impacts for that study, so I couldn't talk to you about it today. But we designed an intervention for 6th graders, just making the transition from elementary to middle school, that promotes this idea of belongingness in school, that it normalizes that transition, that all kids struggle with that transition from elementary to middle school, and that if we can normalize that, we talked with students, we did focus groups, we found out what some of their biggest fears were, some of their biggest concerns were, and we put those on writing exercises and said, here's what some of your classmates said last year about their struggle to fit in, and how they actually got over those struggles, and how teachers and peers helped them with that and helped them navigate that transition successfully. And we're finding main effects for the whole school district. It's not restricted to minority students. That benefits all students in the district. So I'm really excited about the possibility of that intervention as well. Yeah.
That links to sort of my question, which is, so it sounds like you're interested in the next steps of your research to dig deeper into the Madison context, right? Those questions.
Yeah.
How about thinking about, Madison's a place where there's an achievement gap. In that sense, it's a good site. But what's next in terms of the research and bringing that to scale? Have you thought about bringing it to other districts, and what questions that you think would be interesting?
Yeah, so I currently have 2 IES proposals out right now to scale this up to other school districts that are contextually different. Some school districts in Texas, some school districts in Arizona that have a larger Latino population. I'm interested. Madison has a growing Latino population, but I'm really interested to see how these effects might generalize to other contexts. So I go to districts and tell them this story, and I'm just blown away by all of the interest in this intervention, that every district I go to with this idea is, says, where can I sign up? I want to do this. And so I'm at no loss for sites. I just need more grant dollars, but it's costless, right? So, actually, if I had the commitment of schools, all I really need to do is cover some of my time to do the research. Yes?
So, the strategy of a self-affirmation, a writing event like this, is not too unusual in English language arts classes. How did you come about doing it 4 times a year, and why do you think that contributed to the success because teachers do this a lot. They will have daily, weekly journals, and I think there can only come value in relationship building and self-reflection that comes from these kinds of things. But why do you think this particular setup or framework contributed to your results?
Yeah, well, I think that number one, we set it up, so there was no magic number in terms of the number of interventions. I talked with Geoffrey Cohen, and based on some correlational data, he explained to me that there were some kids who received only 3 doses of the intervention or 2 doses of the intervention, and there were some kids who received the full 5 doses. And we see no difference in the impacts regardless of how many times you engaged in this exercise. So we had a lot of back and forth about this, and so I said, well, what's the magic number? He said, there really isn't one. And he said, I'd say maybe 3 or 4. And so we used that guidance along with this idea that we should present the intervention at really key times during the school year, times when they would be more susceptible to stereotype threat, right before these high stakes tests. And so those could be the times, and right before, in some cases, the end of terms and grading periods. Those could be times where students might receive messages, might receive a test score back, or might receive a grade point average back, or might actually be sitting for the test and feel the weight of the stereotypes most strongly. And so that was kind of theoretically our idea, that during those high stress times would be the most opportune time to try to intervene and buffer students from those threats so that they could show their full potential in both the classroom and on the standardized tests.
So can I follow up with
please.
one more question? So do you think, and I guess my real question is, do you think the novelty, do you think the impact would lessen if a teacher did it more frequently? If they were, what you measured had its findings, but you talked about a lot of intangibles that I think are really important. The relationship building, the kids' self-reflection, the metacognitive type of things that come out of all that, and kids just coming to know themselves and developing a learner identity. So I'm wondering if you can do this too much, or you think there was a value in doing it periodically, or anything about that?
Yeah, boy, that's a good question. I think maybe you could induce some of the stronger positive feelings that you're suggesting based on more frequent administrations of the intervention. I personally think that if we opened up the black box to teachers, and like I was mentioning in respect to that previous question, that if teachers were aware of what students wrote about and they could reflect with and interact with the student about those things, that might amplify this intervention's impact even more fully. But and who knows? Maybe another thing that I'm thinking is that our data show that this intervention is context specific. So in some schools it's just not having an impact, and in some schools it really is very strongly. And so that says to me that perhaps when they make that transition to high school and they're no longer within that school context in which we administered the exercise to begin with, that the whole dynamics of that new context might cause students to interpret their world in a very different way, and perhaps that might be an opportune time for further follow-up.
Thank you.
Yes.
On that piece, are you looking to see the context of the school that student transfers into, right? So if the student is they're coming from a low minority population and moving into a high school that's also a low minority population, versus maybe you're right, because district schools combined, maybe now you're in a context in which you aren't a small proportion of students, and so that sort of contextual piece is now gone. Have you looked at that at all?
Yeah, we haven't looked at that. The main reason is because in Madison there are very few high schools. And they're all pretty universally the same. They're kind of big melting pots that take in students from a lot of different middle schools. And so it really is a very different context within the high school as opposed to the middle school. And so that it gives me even more cause to think that, you know, an intervention dealing with, you know, students in that different context might be really beneficial. Yes, sir.
Just a couple of points. For the populations that you're interested in, I'm wondering how salient the tests are. I think there's, you know, some research that shows it matters to us as researchers and to administrators, but kids don't necessarily take them the same way. The second one is, I'm wondering if you've considered other mechanisms underlying the intervention. For example, attribution. So when kids experience a lot of failure, it's natural to attribute it to low IQ, other internal kinds of factors that might shape how you do the intervention in the future. And then the last point is, you know, if you can explain this much variance just based on motivational factors that vary by race and ethnicity, kind of makes me wonder what we're doing in the school in the larger social context that produces those things to begin with.
Yeah, those are all good questions. I don't know if I remember them all. But you know, the unfortunate thing is with this first cohort that we ran, we were not able to get IRB approval in time for student survey, which we have subsequently administered to the students experiencing our social belonging intervention. And we've got really good traction and really good mileage out of that survey, because we've measured a lot of theoretical constructs that we think might be at play. And in fact, with that survey data and with attendance and behavioral referral data, we can explain as mediators over 80% of the treatment effect on that social belonging intervention. That it's pretty much driven by, number one, students' reduced feeling of evaluative anxiety, that they feel less anxiety about tests and about performing well in class. They feel more social belonging, that they fit in school. They feel stronger trust with their teachers and with their peers. And they also feel a stronger locus of control, so that they feel like they're more in control of their destiny. And in addition to that, of course, improved attendance and fewer behavioral referrals play into that as well. But we're able to explain a major chunk of that impact with those kinds of mediators. And I wish we would have had that data with this first cohort, because unfortunately we have somewhat of a black box here where we can't really understand and unpack all those mechanisms that you're referring to.
Did you by chance correlate word count of the essays with the effect sizes?
I know we did that at some point, and I can't recall the result. I don't think that there was a linear relationship. I think at some point, you know, there was a degradation in the impact. If you wrote so much, it no longer impacted you in a positive way. This is one of the first times where I had some really strong concerns about breaking confidentiality. That some students wrote some really horrible things about things that were going on in their school. And this was especially the case in one school where I actually consulted with my IRB, and I got independent psychologists I had review several of the essays that I saw from the school, and it really uncovered some pretty bad things that were going on in that school. And I went and I conferred with my IRB, and I said, can I break confidentiality, because I've got to talk to this principal. And so I talked with the principal, and we were actually able to get some kids some help. And I know that's kind of tangential to your question, but it just kind of sparked that recollection.
Was that for the control group, or for those essays due to their white writing about the?
It was actually a combination, but they were mainly about the treatment kids as opposed to the control kids. But we saw it in both.
So even though they're writing about affirmation, they're writing about negative experiences.
Yeah, they tended to write. I think we saw more of that in the control group than the treatment group, because they tended to write about negative experiences, negative things that were happening. and the control group. And that was actually one thing that concerned me after the first administration of these exercises, because that I thought maybe this control exercise is actually degrading the performance of kids. That, you know, some of them really struggled with this question. Circle 3 things that you are completely unimportant to you, but then imagine yourself being someone else and explain why they might be important to someone else. Literally, some of the kids were brought to tears because they did not understand what we were asking of them. And so we changed up the control exercise and we offered a second version of it after that to see if it made any sort of difference, whether it was that particular control exercise that was causing this larger difference possibly. And so we found it didn't make any difference, that regardless of the control exercise, it had the same impact.
All right, I think the folks are streaming out to classes and things, but this was wonderful. Thank you very much for coming.